It's finally game time, baby. It's Call of Duty week. My word, we're finally here. The official start of the Call of Duty League is only like, a few days away at this point. And today we're going over the power rankings, the final preseason power rankings before we finally get to see these teams go toe to toe and face off this weekend, man. Obviously, I'm so pumped to finally see these teams go at it. And with the new formats of the home series leading into major events, I mean, this is gonna be awesome and I cannot be more excited. So with that said, let's finally talk some competitive Call of Duty. Let's go. So first of all, I've got to give props to our sponsor of today's video, Draft Buff. If you don't know what Draft Buff is, it's basically fantasy football, but for the Call of Duty League. And man, it's an absolute blast. They have different formats so you can compete in. Like they have a DFS style called Draft Royale, where you pick a team based off a budget, and you can join the Salvation League Community Draft Royale to compete against myself and compete against the rest of the community in that Draft Royale. So the link is down in the description for that. They also have other game modes like season-long leagues where you draft your team like a normal fantasy football league and compete against your friends, up to 8 teams in a league. And that's also a blast. But I highly recommend you go check out Draft Buff. It's an absolute blast, like a genuine good time. It makes watching the Call of Duty League even more fun and just adds to the experience. It's a pretty natural sponsor for like a video like this, and that's why I was really happy to have Draft Buff on board. So again, use the link down in the description to go join the Draft Royale, compete against myself and the rest of the community, and enjoy Draft Buff during the Call of Duty League this season. So now, without further ado, let's finally talk the power rankings for the CDL. Let's go. Okay, so there is going to be a ton to work through in this video, which gets me hyped. Also, I hope you guys enjoyed that little express gameplay, little nasty clip, you know, things you love to see. But this is the template we're going to be using today to power rank these teams. Basically, we're going to slot them in different tiers, whether it's needs work, in the mixed, contender, or elite. And then we'll go through and order them all inside of their categories or their tiers, so we get a literal full 1 through 12. It's going to be a blast. If you haven't watched the power rankings before, it's a good time. So finally, after all the intro, let's get straight to these teams. Let's go. Alrighty, so the first team we're talking about today is none other than the London Royal Ravens. So we'll probably speed through these teams pretty quickly, putting them into their categories, and then I'll explain further why those teams were in their categories when we talk about them specifically, when we're ranking them 1 to 12. So there'll be a few layers to this one as we move through it. This is an interesting one, definitely a tough one to start off with, because obviously, in the kickoff event, they lost a close one, 3-2 to Paris. We haven't seen a lot of them scrimming, but now they have none other than Parasite playing with them in place of Zero, because Zero was playing from London, having internet issues, and he couldn't get to the States because COVID. It's a tough situation for London to be in right now. They looked pretty decent in some scrims that we saw against OpTic that were streamed. And so there is some potential upside for them in the long term. Again, we're going to be throwing these teams into their tiers first, and then help sort them based off the teams that are around them in those tiers. So for now, I'm going to throw London in the needs work categories, but you know, there's some potential there moving forward. Let's keep going. Up next, we got the New York Subliners, another tough team, of course, with the issues with Hydra. Two teams that have had a lot of roster issues at the beginning of this year, of course, with Hydra stuck in Paris because of COVID as well. So they brought in a Sim, and then Zuma, you know, retired or stepped away from Call of Duty or whatever. And so they had to replace him with Diamond Con. And that roster is really working it out right now. Man, they're right on the fringe of needs work and in the mix. They've had a little bit more time together than London has, and I like the upside for this team a little bit more. So I'm going to throw them in the mix category, but they'll probably end up being near the back of it. Oh, we got the Dallas Empire up next. I mean, that's an easy slot, and we all know they're inside the elite category, definitely near the top of it. We're going to have some interesting conversations to have as well a little bit later in this. Then we've got the Seattle Surge, and they have not looked fantastic by any means. They're definitely as well on the fringe of needs work and in the mix. Wow. I might have to reconsider later, but for now, we're going to throw them in the needs work category. Atlanta Faze, okay, we all know where they're also in the elite categories. Obviously, inside of the kickoff event, they struggled against the Mutineers, but there's a lot more. We'll talk about that in a second. Now we got Paris, and honestly, this one's interesting because I think Paris has some upside. I'm going to throw them in the mixed categories for now, and we'll, of course, talk about them a little bit more in a second. Then we got OpTic Chicago. I think all of you guys know where they are. They're inside the elite category as well. Then we got the Minnesota Rokkr. I think they have a pretty decent chance so far, so we'll throw them in the contenders category. Then we got the LA Thieves. It's been tough for them, a tough go so far for them. They're either at the back of the in mix or in the needs work categories. Man, I'm going to throw them in the needs work categories, but that doesn't feel very good either. We got the Toronto Ultra, and they're on the fringe of in the mix and a contender. I would say that they're probably in the contender category. On the backside, probably. The Mutineers, they look very, very good. I would say they're inside the elite category still right now. And then our final team here is the LA Guerillas, and they're on the needs work in the mix category for now. I think I'll throw them in the mix somewhere in there. So here's our teams and where I think they might sit. We'll talk about a few of these. We'll start the backside here. Inside of the needs work categories and in the mix categories, there's some tough debates about, the LA Thieves versus LAG and how these teams are potentially performing right now. Obviously, the LA Thieves got just totally bodied by OpTic Gaming inside the kickoff event. It was a hot 3-0 and it wasn't pretty by any means. And you can say the same thing about the New York Subliners. Of course, they were coming off of basically like a week of practice heading into their match against Dallas in the kickoff event. So that was a destined to be a bloodbath from the beginning. And so that's why it's a little bit tough with those teams right now. I can see the argument for any of these teams basically being in either of these categories. I think it's a pretty dead set top 6, bottom 6 right now. Realistically, any of these bottom 6 teams could surprise and make a move towards the contenders category. Like I said, it's pretty obviously split between the top 6 and the bottom 6 right now. There's a few teams that are flirting with maybe the top 6, like LAG at times. And we've seen moments of Seattle looking good, but inside of the kickoff event against LAG, neither team looked pretty impressive. And we've seen some pretty ugly score lines between some of these top 4 teams versus like Seattle Surge, 100T, New York Subliners, LAG. Obviously, I think maybe some OpTic fans might be thinking like LAG played really well against OpTic in a scrim just a few days ago, but that was on LAG's host. And again, LAG was hosting from California. All 4 of them are West Coast, where basically the rest of the league is hosting from Texas. When they actually are playing their events this weekend, they're going to be on dedicated servers, and then they can veto dedicated servers. There's one server in like that mountain time region, and so realistically, that'll probably be where those are played. Maybe Chicago's potential as well. But that's why it's hard to take away anything from that series, because I mean, you could hear it in OpTic's tone when they were talking about that. It is tough again, because again, we basically only see scrims from OpTic's perspective. Once in a while, Clay has streamed some scrims, but that's because they're in such an early learning stage right now that he doesn't feel like they're giving away any strats. So that's why he's willing to stream right now. So besides that, we really don't get to see too much else from the other teams outside of the kickoff event, and that was only one match. So it is pretty difficult to power rank right now. After this weekend, we're gonna have a lot more information, and we'll be doing some more future power rankings on the podcast, or in videos like this as well. So with that said, all of those things considered, I'm still gonna stick with London probably as the worst team right now. Probably lean then Seattle at 11, and then LA Thieves at 10, which doesn't feel good. Obviously, the talent on the Seattle Surge team, the talent on the LA Thieves team is insane. There is so much potential for the London team as well, with what we saw at Champs last year. The type of players that these guys are and what they could potentially do is really interesting, and having Parasite on that team is pretty wild at this point as well. I don't expect anything too crazy from London early on in the season here. But this weekend, we do have some pretty interesting matchups, with London playing Seattle. LA Thieves is playing the Rokkr and the Subliners. So we're going to get some of these interesting ones early on here. And the Surge get to play Dallas in their first match as well. So some really fun ones for them as a whole. So we'll learn a lot about these teams pretty early on with the matchups they have here, whether New York is better, whether LA Thieves is better. So it is tough for me to decide if LA Thieves deserves to be in the needs work category. I'm more inclined to put them in the mix category, but still a little bit behind the other teams. So I'm gonna move them up and then throw New York in here, throw Paris and LAG. I'll put LAG at the top of this category, but not by much. I think there is a pretty big gap here still between the top 6. So I'll slide them back a little bit just like that. And then throw Paris right maybe above the New York Subliner. So we'll throw it in something along those lines like that. Center these a little bit. Now we're moving a little bit here. So we got our top 6, our bottom 6 lined up here with 12 London, 11 Seattle, and going down the list from there. And now we're into our top 6. So the contenders side here with the Ultra and the Rokkr. I do lean that the Rokkr are better than the Ultra. In the kickoff event, they did win in a 3-2 fashion in a pretty wild series. It'll be the most interesting and competitive series of the whole weekend. Lean that the Rokkr are just slightly ahead of the Ultra, something along those lines, like right there. Again, I'm trying to create a pretty realistic gap of space between how good I think these top 4 teams are versus the rest of the competition right now. I think there's a pretty big tier gap at this point between these 4 teams and the rest of the competition. So this is where we're sitting. I mean, we got our top 4 teams here: OpTic, Empire, Faze, and the Mutineers in some order like that. And we're looking at the rest of the competition like, no one's really that close. When you look at this group, it does get pretty tough off the rip. Obviously, in a recent scrim, supposedly OpTic beat Empire. I think it was 5-4 was reported by Scump. You can take away something from that these teams are very, very close. Obviously, I still want to give the edge to the Empire though. I just want to see it from OpTic. I think OpTic's a better hardpoint team. I do think if they were to play, it would go to a game 5, which is pretty tough. And then when you look at the Mutineers and Atlanta Faze, it's like, man, you know, we saw the Mutineers beat Atlanta at the kickoff event, which was a really, really good series. But again, it was on a brand new meta with no snipers, and Faze basically had barely played any S&D at that point, and they lost both S&Ds to the Mutineers. So in my mind, even though that was the case, like even though the Mutineers did beat Florida in that kickoff event, in a rematch, Faze would beat Florida right now. So that's where we're sitting. So I think the Mutineers are in a very close, like 4th place right now. Atlanta Faze probably in 3rd. And what's really exciting is that we're going to be able to see this OpTic versus Faze matchup this weekend, the last match of the whole weekend on Sunday. And man, that is going to be hype beyond belief. But I do think that right now OpTic has the advantage in hard points. I would lean that they have the advantage in control as well. S&D is still a complete toss-up considering we've seen basically next to zero S&D from any of these teams, and the only S&D we did see was on the new meta with no snipers, no smokes, basically a few days after that GA came through at the kickoff event. So there is a lot of wild cards in place when it comes to S&D throughout this whole weekend and what could happen. We'll talk a lot more about that on the podcast as well. We'll be going matchup by matchup, doing predictions and some X factors inside of the podcast, so I highly recommend checking that out tomorrow. But I'm going to have OpTic ahead of Faze at this point, and then it comes down to, all right, who do you think wins an S&D between Empire and OpTic for that top spot? I give the edge to Empire overall in S&D, and that's why I'm going to give Empire the slightest of advantages in 1st place right now. So it's sitting like something like legitimately right next to each other. And then we'll have a little bit of a gap between Faze, a little bit of a gap between the Mutineers, and then a big gap between the Rokkr and the Ultra. And then there's a little bit of a gap between the rest of the other 6 teams as well. So there's our final top 12 teams right now, or the rankings for all the Call of Duty teams right now, the power rankings. Drop all your comments down below. I would love to hear what you guys have to say about this, the X factors, the things that come into mind when power ranking these teams, and where you're at with all of the teams in the CDL right now. Again, the podcast is going to be pretty exciting tomorrow. We're going through all of the matchups. ILLeY is making an appearance talking about the challengers and the elite series, and there's gonna be some really, really good information there. Again, shout out Draft Buff as well. Click the link down in the description. Join the Draft Royale for CDL Atlanta and compete against myself and the rest of the community in all of their game modes. It's a blast, man. Invite your friends onto the app, create a league, and have a good time with it. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you guys did, like, comment, subscribe, share the video if you guys really enjoyed it. But as always, guys, I'm your boy, Abezy, and we will see you next time. I'm out.